Tucked into the high desert of central Oregon, outside a small town most people have never heard of, sits a shallow rock shelter that has quietly rewritten the story of the first Americans. Rimrock Draw is now considered the oldest confirmed site of human occupation anywhere in North America, older than the famous Clovis culture by thousands of years. But here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The number scientists have already confirmed may not even be the true age of this site. Some researchers believe the real figure could be older still. Camel bones, a massive volcanic eruption, a stone tool stained with ancient blood. All of it is about to rewrite the story of who actually got to this continent first. Just outside the small town of Riley, Oregon, sits a modest rock shelter cut into the high desert landscape. Nothing about it looks remarkable from the outside. No dramatic cave mouth, no obvious monument, nothing that would make a passing traveler stop and take notice. It is simply a shallow overhang of rock, the kind of feature scattered across the American West by the thousands. In 2011, archaeologists from the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History identified this particular shelter, known as Rimrock Draw, as a site worth real investigation. Surface finds hinted that something significant might be buried beneath the dry desert soil, but nobody standing there that year could have possibly guessed just how significant it was actually about to become. The team began a careful, methodical excavation using modern archaeological techniques and technology to work through the layers of sediment without damaging whatever lay preserved inside them. Think about that for a moment. Nobody expected this quiet, unassuming shelter, sitting in an unremarkable stretch of Oregon desert, to eventually challenge nearly everything textbooks had confidently stated about who the first Americans actually were and when they actually arrived on this continent. To understand exactly why what they were about to find mattered so much, you first have to understand the story that had already been accepted for decades. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation for how humans first arrived in North America centered on a single group known as the Clovis culture. According to that model, the first Americans crossed from Siberia roughly 13,000 years ago, traveling across a land bridge called Beringia. From there, the story went, they pushed south through a narrow, ice-free corridor that had opened up between two massive, retreating ice sheets, eventually spreading out across the entire continent. For a long time, this was simply accepted as settled fact. It was clean, it was straightforward. It gave American prehistory a clear starting point, a defined moment when the story of human life on this continent officially began. Generations of researchers built their work directly on top of that foundational timeline, treating the ice-free corridor as the obvious, logical doorway through which every subsequent wave of early human settlement eventually passed. But foundations built on incomplete evidence have a tendency to eventually crack. And by the time researchers turned their full attention toward Rimrock Draw, that particular foundation had already begun showing real, serious signs of strain. Newer geological and archaeological evidence was starting to suggest that the clean, simple Clovis story might not hold up nearly as well as it once appeared to, and that the true timeline of human arrival in the Americas might stretch back considerably further than anyone had seriously considered. That tension between a comfortable, long-accepted model and a growing body of evidence that refused to fit neatly inside it is exactly the environment Rimrock Draw was about to step directly into. Nobody working that excavation in 2011 set out specifically to overturn the Clovis timeline. They were simply following careful, patient archaeological method, layer by layer, exactly the way the work is supposed to be done. But what they were slowly uncovering beneath that unremarkable Oregon rock shelter was about to become one of the most serious direct challenges the old model had ever faced. And to understand exactly how serious that challenge actually was, you first need to understand precisely how shaky the old ice-free corridor story had already become, well before a single artifact was ever pulled out of Rimrock Draw's ancient sediment. Here is the problem that had already been quietly undermining the old ice-free corridor story for years. Newer research into the actual geological history of that corridor revealed something the original Clovis model had never accounted for. The corridor itself did not fully open until somewhere between 11 and 12,000 years ago. and even after it opened, it remained genuinely uninhabitable for centuries afterward. A barren, resource-poor stretch of land that offered little in the way of food, shelter, or any realistic means of survival for a group trying to move through it. Think about what that timing problem actually does to the traditional story. If the corridor itself did not become passable until 11 or 12,000 years ago, it becomes essentially impossible for it to have served as the route the Clovis people supposedly used to spread south roughly 13,000 years ago. The doorway the entire model depended on simply was not open yet, at exactly the moment people were supposed to be walking through it. That contradiction alone would have been serious enough, but it did not stand alone for very long. Other sites across North America had already begun turning up evidence that directly supported an earlier human presence, entirely independent of whatever was happening at Rimrock Draw. The Meadowcroft Rockshelter in Pennsylvania produced artifacts dated to at least 16,000 years old, a full 3,000 years earlier than the traditional Clovis timeline allowed for. Around the same period, Cooper's Ferry in Idaho was independently dated to roughly that same age, offering a second, geographically distant confirmation that people were already present on this continent, well before the old ice-free corridor could have possibly served as anyone's entry point. Consider what those two sites, found in completely different regions, both returning similar dates, actually suggested to researchers paying close attention. If people were already living in Pennsylvania and Idaho 16,000 years ago, and the interior corridor genuinely did not open until several thousand years after that, then the first Americans had to have arrived by some other route entirely. That growing body of evidence gave real, serious weight to an alternative explanation researchers call the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Rather than walking south through a frozen, unforgiving interior corridor, the theory proposes that early humans instead moved down the Pacific coastline, likely by boat, following a genuinely rich and reliable coastal ecosystem the entire way. Dense kelp forests stretching along the shoreline, seals hauled out on rocky outcrops, abundant shellfish beds exposed at low tide, an entire, sustainable food source available consistently along the coast, in sharp contrast to the barren interior corridor that supposedly did not even exist yet in a usable form. Think about how much more plausible that coastal route actually sounds, once you lay it directly beside the traditional interior corridor story. Instead of an unproven, likely impassable route through solid ice, you have a genuinely livable pathway, rich with food, stretching continuously along an entire coastline, exactly the kind of route skilled coastal people would have been able to follow safely, generation after generation. By the time researchers turned their full attention toward that quiet, unremarkable rock shelter outside Riley, Oregon, the old Clovis first model was already under serious, sustained pressure from multiple independent directions at once. What nobody could have fully anticipated yet was just how directly Rimrock Draw itself was about to add to that mounting pressure, and exactly how much further back it was about to push the entire timeline. The first genuinely major breakthrough at Rimrock Draw came when the excavation team unearthed fragments of camel teeth and jaw buried deep within the shelter's ancient sediment. These specific remains belong to Camelops hesternus, an extinct species researchers sometimes call yesterday's camel. And these were not small animals. Standing roughly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing close to 1,800 pounds, they towered over the slender dromedaries most people picture today when they hear the word camel. Here's a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it. Camels themselves actually evolved right here in North America, long before ever migrating outward into Asia and Africa. And in a strange twist of history, the species eventually went completely extinct in the very continent where it first originated, surviving instead only in the populations that had already spread abroad. But these particular camel remains were not simply the bones of an animal that wandered into the shelter, died naturally, and was left undisturbed. Researchers found deliberate cut marks directly on the bone, along with stone tools recovered in direct physical association with the remains. Taken together, that evidence pointed toward something far more specific than a natural death. This was a targeted kill, followed by deliberate processing and butchering carried out by human hands. And directly above those camel remains sat the detail that would ultimately make this entire discovery possible to date with real precision. A distinct layer of volcanic ash sitting sealed above the bone like a lid pressed down over the past. In archaeology, a layer like that is genuinely priceless. Volcanic ash can be dated with remarkable accuracy through a process called tephrochronology, the careful chemical fingerprinting of individual volcanic eruptions. Every major eruption releases ash carrying its own distinct chemical signature, specific enough that researchers can trace a single layer back to one particular eruption on one particular volcano at one particular point in deep time. In this case, the ash sealing the camel remains was traced directly back to Mount St Helens. Not the well-known 1980 eruption most people alive today actually remember, but a far older, considerably more massive event known as the S's eruption, which occurred more than 15,600 years ago. Think carefully about what that sealed ash layer actually proves. If the camel remains were sitting beneath that specific layer of volcanic ash, then whatever was down there had to be older, genuinely older, than the eruption itself. The ash did not simply date the layer it sat within. It effectively locked in everything sitting beneath it, sealing the remains away from the outside world and preserving them completely undisturbed for well over 15,000 years. That single, sealed layer of ash turned an already interesting discovery into something considerably more significant. It gave researchers an undeniable physical timestamp, one that could not easily be argued away or explained by contamination, mixing, or disturbance from more recent activity at the site. And once that timestamp was firmly established, an obvious next question demanded a real answer. If the camel remains themselves were sealed beneath ash, more than 15,600 years old, exactly how old were the remains actually sitting underneath that seal? The answer that came back from the lab would end up being even more staggering than anyone excavating that quiet Oregon shelter had genuinely expected. Here is the number that changed everything. Radiocarbon dating performed directly on the enamel of the camel tooth returned an age of approximately 18,250 years before present. Let that figure actually settle for a moment, because it deserves real attention. Before we go any further, it is worth understanding exactly what that phrase before present actually means, since it is not simply a more formal way of saying years ago. Scientific convention calibrates these dates against the year 1950 specifically. That particular year marks the point when large-scale radiocarbon dating first began in earnest, right before nuclear weapons testing started releasing enough radiation into the atmosphere to meaningfully alter global carbon-14 levels worldwide. To keep every measurement consistent and comparable across the entire field, researchers fixed that single reference point permanently, rather than continuously updating the number relative to whatever year happens to be current. So when a result comes back listed as before present, that number is anchored to 1950, not to today. And in this specific case, that anchor placed the camel tooth enamel at roughly 18,250 years before that fixed reference point. Think about what a single number like that actually does to the accepted story of the first Americans. The traditional Clovis timeline placed the earliest confirmed human presence in North America at roughly 13,000 years ago. This one result alone, from a single camel tooth pulled out of an unremarkable Oregon Rockshelter, pushed that confirmed timeline back by more than 5,000 years in a single stroke. 5,000 years is not a minor adjustment. It is not the kind of small correction researchers quietly absorb and move past without much comment. It represents a genuinely massive expansion of the confirmed human story on this continent, stretching the timeline back into a period most researchers had confidently assumed was still empty of any human presence at all. But here is the honest limitation researchers had to sit with at this exact stage of the investigation. A single butchered camel, however striking, cannot on its own definitively prove sustained, deliberate human intent. Animals can occasionally show damage from natural causes. Bones can sometimes be misread, particularly when a single specimen is examined in isolation without any additional corroborating evidence sitting alongside it to strengthen the case. What the team genuinely needed next was something considerably harder to explain away through any alternative, non-human explanation. something that could not plausibly be attributed to a scavenging predator, a natural geological process, or simple coincidence. They needed direct physical evidence of deliberate human tool use, ideally tied directly to the same time period the camel remains had already established. And as it turned out, that exact kind of evidence was already sitting in the ground nearby, waiting to be carefully excavated, catalogued, and eventually tested using techniques considerably more advanced than anything available to archaeologists working just a few decades earlier. What the team was about to recover from deeper within that same layer of sediment would not simply support the camel evidence. It would strengthen the entire case for genuine, deliberate human presence at Rimrock Draw in a way that would prove considerably harder for skeptics to dismiss or explain away. Alongside the camel remains, the excavation team recovered something that would end up mattering just as much to this story as the bones themselves. A set of finely crafted stone scrapers made from a distinctive material known as orange agate. That specific material choice matters considerably more than it might first appear. Agate was genuinely prized by early toolmakers because of the way it fractures. It breaks with what is known as a conchoidal fracture, essentially shattering the same way glass does, producing edges sharp enough for real, practical cutting work rather than a dull, unreliable edge that would fail quickly under actual use. But here's the detail that turns these particular scrapers from simply interesting artifacts into something considerably more revealing about the people who made them. Orange agate does not occur naturally anywhere in the immediate basalt walls surrounding this specific rock shelter. This was not local material, casually picked up off the ground a few feet from where it was ultimately used. It was, by every reasonable measure, an exotic material, meaning it had to be deliberately carried into the shelter from somewhere else entirely, or obtained through direct trade with another group who already had access to it. Think about what that single choice actually reveals about the people responsible for it. These were not individuals passively grabbing whatever raw stone happened to be lying around nearby. They were deliberately seeking out, and specifically selecting, a particular material they clearly understood held real, practical advantages over whatever was locally available. That is not the kind of decision-making you'd expect from a group simply passing through once in a hurry with no real investment in the specific location. One of these recovered scrapers was later subjected to residue analysis, a chemical testing process specifically designed to detect ancient, preserved proteins still clinging to a tool's surface even after thousands of years have passed. What that analysis found was, in every sense, the smoking gun this entire investigation had been building toward. Clear traces of bison blood residue preserved directly on the stone. You might reasonably wonder how something as fragile as blood could possibly survive intact for thousands of years. The answer comes down to simple physical protection. Those delicate protein fragments become trapped deep within the microscopic fissures and cracks naturally present in the stone tool's surface, effectively sealed away from bacteria and ultraviolet light, the two forces primarily responsible for breaking organic material down over time. In that sheltered, protected environment, the residue essentially became fossilized in place. That result confirmed the scraper had been used specifically to butcher large game, almost certainly bison antiquus, the considerably larger ancient ancestor of the modern buffalo still roaming parts of North America today. And the evidence did not stop there. A second scraper was later discovered buried even deeper within the same volcanic ash layer, providing further confirmation that this shelter had genuinely been occupied well before the Mount St Helens eruption sealed everything in place. The deliberate, repeated use of a specific, non-local material like orange agate strongly suggests real experimentation and technological sophistication, the kind of pattern that only develops when a group spends enough time in one particular region to properly discover, test, and repeatedly return to their best available resources. That is a pattern far more consistent with genuine, settled, long-term occupation than with a single, brief, transient visit passing quickly through the area. Taken together, this evidence means something genuinely remarkable. Humans were settled in what is now Central Oregon during the absolute height of the last glacial maximum, a period when ice sheets across the continent sat at their thickest, and global ocean levels ran hundreds of feet lower than they do today. In that harsh, demanding environment, people at Rimrock Draw were deliberately butchering camels and bison roughly 18,000 years ago. Understanding exactly how researchers can state that with real confidence comes down to a basic, foundational principle of geology. Stone tools were discovered even further down in the sediment than the camel remains themselves, sitting in layers positioned beneath both the volcanic ash and the camel teeth. That layering follows what geologists call the law of superposition, a straightforward but powerful rule stating that in any undisturbed sequence of sediment, the oldest material always sits at the very bottom, with progressively younger layers stacking directly on top as time passes. Applied here, that principle means the tools found deepest in the sediment genuinely predate both the volcanic eruption and the camel remains sitting above them. And that single fact currently places Rimrock Draw Rockshelter as the oldest confirmed site of human occupation anywhere in North America, predating the long-accepted Clovis culture by more than 5,000 years. But some archaeologists directly involved with this project believe the true age of the site could actually run considerably deeper than even that already staggering number suggests. Here is the honest reasoning behind that claim, and why it genuinely matters. The current benchmark date of 18,250 years before present comes exclusively from the camel tooth itself. And that camel tooth was found sitting above the deepest artifacts recovered from the site, not directly alongside them. In archaeological science, there is an important, careful distinction to keep in mind here. When a date comes from an associated animal remain, rather than directly from a human-made tool or the remains of an actual hearth, that date gets treated specifically as a minimum age. Researchers sometimes describe it plainly as a no later than marker, rather than a confirmed definitive age for everything recovered from the site. Think about what that distinction genuinely means in practical terms. If the camel itself was already lying there 18,250 years ago, then logically, anything buried beneath that camel in the sediment must have been deposited even earlier than that already ancient date, which raises a genuinely striking possibility. Early humans may have been actively using this exact shelter during a period approaching, or potentially even surpassing, 20,000 years ago. As excavation work continues and as more of these deeply buried artifacts get properly tested and dated, particularly tools carrying preserved traces of ancient animal residue like the bison blood already confirmed, researchers expect the full picture of early American occupation to keep growing clearer, layer by careful layer. The ultimate prize driving all of this continued, painstaking work remains the same question that has genuinely intrigued scientists for generations. Who were the first Americans really? And exactly when did they finally call this continent home for good? Right now, the honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, not completely. But a quiet, unremarkable rock shelter outside a small town in central Oregon has already pushed that answer back further than almost anyone seriously expected, and it may not be finished rewriting the story quite yet. A quiet rock shelter outside a small Oregon town, first surveyed in 2011, has become one of the most consequential archaeological sites in North America. Not because of one single dramatic find, but because of a butchered camel, a sealed layer of volcanic ash, an exotic stone tool, and a trace of ancient bison blood, all pointing toward the same conclusion. People were here, doing deliberate, skilled work at the height of the last ice age. The confirmed number already rewrites the textbooks. The deeper layers still waiting beneath it may rewrite them again. Who the first Americans actually were and how long ago they arrived is still an open question, and Rimrock Draw isn't finished answering it yet. Subscribe for the next investigation.